as a historian, how would you place this moment in this long history of, let's say, more than 100 years since the Balfour Declaration? How would you describe what is happening in Palestine at this moment?
Well, it's interesting to make a quick comparison with what happened in the Indian subcontinent, because in both British Empire in India and in the British Mandate in this part of West Asia, the British decided to do the same sort of thing, which is to partition what they thought was a intractable problem. In India, partition the country, create a so-called Muslim country and a so-called Hindu country, and let 13 million people go across, an initially imaginary border. 1 million people died in the partition of the Indian subcontinent. It was a brutal death toll. 1 million people. My family comes from Lahore to what is now India, and so on. 13 million people made the journey, but there was, in a sense, a recognition that there's now a Pakistan and there's an India. And there was really no attempt by either side to go and conquer the other. Okay, firstly, scale wise, it was perhaps impossible. There was a fight in Kashmir, but that was over Kashmir, not about the fact of Pakistan and the fact of India. And now we understand the fact of Pakistan and the fact of India. In the British Mandate in West Asia, the story is different, because just as the British announced the partition of the land into a country for the Jews and the country for the Arabs, which is how they saw it, the not yet created country of the Jews, which had already developed an army, just went and conquered all the land. And throughout the citizenry, you had 700,000 Palestinians expelled from the land, moved to camps in Gaza and in Lebanon, in Israel, in Jordan, and so on, and further afield. Yeah, it's a very different history. It's violent, just as the partition in South Asia was violent. But here, the new state of Israel fundamentally did not recognize the Palestinians as a neighboring country, as an entity, as a people, and have since 1948 conducted a permanent Nakba, attempted to basically annihilate the Palestinians from the area, take all the land, from the river to the sea for Israel, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, and perhaps further. There are plans to go further than the Jordan River, of course, to take large tracts of Syria. Already, if you look at the map, there's a place called Methuselah's Finger into Lebanon, where the so-called the line of control between Lebanon and Israel is almost a straight line from the Mediterranean. But then you get to the edge of where the Golan Heights are, and there's this finger of Israel going into Lebanon. Why? To control the water. To control a water source. They just went and conquered that piece. It's called Methuselah's Finger. Won't give it up. So there is a kind of imagination in Israel just taking the whole thing. Imagine the Indian military in 1947 saying, forget partition. We're going to just send the tanks and take all of what is to be Pakistan. Didn't happen. But it did happen in Israel, and Israel is continuing to want to annihilate the Palestinians.
I wanted to ask you something about how do you look at the Palestinian resistance movement or national movement at this point in time? Because I had Muin Rabbani on my show, and I asked him about what could be some of the things to be optimistic at this moment, where it's impossible to be optimistic in a way, but not to be fatalistic. One has to look for hopes, and he did talk about some of these changes, and we'll come to that. But one of the things is said that the Palestinian movement seems to be lacking at this point in time, as opposed to maybe in the 80s, where the PLO, regardless of all its failures, it was a strong national movement. He said that the divisions have been very striking, and the Palestinian cause now lacks a united nationalist movement. What are your thoughts about the divisions within these different factions of Palestinian movement?
Every national liberation movement has a series of groups because there are different views of what's going on. There is certainly a kind of Palestinian center that used to be very much in the forefront of people's imagination, and that was the Palestinian Liberation Organization, brought together all the factions. Fatah, the Palestinian left, and so on, were all in the PLO. The PLO fractures at the time of Oslo. Until the Oslo agreements of 1994, now more than 30 years ago, until Oslo, the PLO was a central focus of Palestinian resistance. After Oslo, you have a split between those who accepted Oslo and those who rejected Oslo. Who rejected Oslo? The the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, a whole bunch of these groups said we don't accept Oslo. Oslo is a surrender. That's what Edward Said called it, a surrender. That was really the major split in the PLO, the major split. But 20 years ago, when the leaders of all these groups clandestinely were able to communicate in Israeli prisons, very interesting story. They were in different prisons, they were incommunicado, but they were able to get messages to each other. These are the leaders of the major factions. They wrote together in different prisons a letter, which was then secretly smuggled out and then released as the prisoner's letter, where the prisoners argued about 20 years ago, saying, look, we need a new national project. We now come to understand the failures of Oslo. Palestinian Authority has become policeman for the Israeli occupation. It's not really carrying forward the PLO's vision. We need a new politics. We need a new horizon. But interestingly, when this letter was leaked, the Israelis recognized that's a threat. The last thing they want is Marwan Barghouti and all these people to be out of prison and creating a new Palestinian national project. So punctually, almost in a timetable, the Israelis kept picking up leaders of the different Palestinian factions, tossing them into isolation. Khalid Jarrar here, Barghouti already in prison, and so on. Not allowing Palestinian politics to come together. The West was never interested in this, nor the Gulf Arabs. Fascinatingly, 2023, the Chinese brought legitimate representatives. This is very important that I use the word legitimate representatives, because a lot of leaders are sitting in jail, in Israeli jails, held in administrative detention without allowance of politics and so on. So leaders or representatives of these movements were brought to China. Again, a lot of clandestine work in bringing them there. They met together, they discussed the need of unity, and they released, for the first time in about 40 years, they released the 14-party statement in 2024. It's an extremely important statement. But they are being effectively eroded, their capacity to move, as a consequence of Israeli pressure on the ground. They are extremely having a hard time building the politics further. But I would like to say optimistically that the 14-party statement is a real opening. And I don't know what is going on, again, in the pipes, in the infrastructure of politics, in the clandestine work, in the conversations they're having. I'm not sure what they are building, but they certainly have seen the light of the prisoner's letter of the 2000s, 2004, where the prisoner said, listen, 10 years after Oslo, we need a new dynamic. And I know that the 14-party statement, 30 years after Oslo, has finally brought them together. Where this will go, can speculate a little bit, but I think we just leave it there and watch it.
The countries that are primarily responsible for what is happening in Palestine are United States to lead, and Europe comes second. I mean, there have been some dishonorable exceptions in the global south. India and Azerbaijan comes to our mind, but these are very insignificant countries, frankly. If the West was not giving them weapons, ideological support, and all kinds of diplomatic and other kinds of intelligence support and so on. Lately, we've been seeing these moral tantrums in a way on part of Europeans saying we would recognize the Palestinian state while maintaining these facade of, fighting to eliminate Hamas. So it's basically gives Israel the green light to keep doing what it has been doing. And the United States has, of course, gone off the deep end. So that's something we are seeing at the level of the officials. On the other hand, and this is something which Moin Rabbani said is something one should not be fatalistic about, there is a groundswell of support within this imperial core among people in general, including a lot of Jewish people in the United States. If you could comment on these two kinds of contradictory developments that we are seeing in the imperial core with regards to the question of Palestine.
Well, let's just say what it is, which is that large numbers of people in the imperial core have been taking to the streets pretty consistently, and they've broken to some extent the wall of the criticism of anti-Semitism. Look, anti-Semitism is a real problem. It's racism. It's a form of racism. These are real problems. But the argument that critique of Israel is anti-Semitic, that argument has faced now a real challenge and has not been able to sustain itself. Which is why, after all this mass starvation, look at where you have to get for Keir Starmer to stand up and say, well, there's a problem. Look at where you have to get for Donald Trump to say people are starving in Gaza. Yes, Donald, that's a factual statement. It's actually not outrage. You just said a factual thing. People are starving. And in fact, I think he said too many people are starving. I'm not exactly sure what his words were. But whatever it might be, these people are saying this on the one side because they are facing pressure. People are speaking to them directly and saying, what is going on here? It's ridiculous, ludicrous that, you're allowing this, you're funding it. You've put, the British have been providing intelligence support, air flights over Gaza of their intelligence planes, directing attacks and so on. They have a direct role in the genocide, not even sort of passively supporting, even with arms. It's a form of passive support compared to providing targeting information. Yeah, you got surveillance planes and so on. Active participation. This is one pressure, but the other is that it is also true that the Palestinians are facing something that I think people in the West haven't seen in a long time. This starvation campaign, which, even in places like Sudan, when there was a famine-related incident, 2020, 2011, 2012, 2021, these were not starvation campaigns where somebody has directly said, Netanyahu is the most horrendous character. His character is doubtful. The Iranians just announced we have a problem with water. Netanyahu released a statement drinking a glass of water saying we stand with the Iranian people. What is that? That's a fraternity prank. He's that kind of character. Remember, a dozen or so people died in the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris. And all the world leaders came, including Netanyahu, to march down the street saying, we condemn this. Where is the march now? Where are Macron and all? When are they going to say we're going to march down the streets of Gaza City, bringing aid with us? Nothing. These are hypocritical people. So the hypocrisy is on the table, but it's also true that they are now making some statements pushed by the people and the terrible circumstance in Gaza.
Even what happened on October 7th itself is another example. 800 something people, civilians were killed. Let's assume all were killed by Hamas. There are contested reports that some of them might be killed by the Israelis, but let's say Hamas killed them. Now more than 1,000 people have been killed. Some reports are now saying 2,000 have been killed in the food distribution sites themselves. That's much more than the number of people killed by Hamas, even if one assumes that everyone was killed by Hamas. My final question here, since you drew the parallel with the Indian subcontinent, I think one of the key difference in the case of Israel is that we had a settler colonial people. I mean, these are Europeans basically coming from there in the Indian subcontinent. These were all people living there, and there was a division within that, and so you didn't have this quote unquote demographic problem. And if one looks at history, United States, Australia, I mean, places where settler colonial nations became republic or nation states eventually, it has it has basically been able to do that after erasing the entire people. Now, of course, as Ilan Pape writes, that Israel faces a problem because it's a 18th century settler colonial nation in a settler colonial state in a 21st century. Uh, what is what can be the resolution? Many people talk about one state. It's very difficult to even think about one state. Well, I understand because the argument is that it's extremely difficult to think about the two states when the settlers have expanded so much, and they are the most important constituency for the Israeli state, no matter who comes there. And so no one is going to dismantle them. And that's the argument behind saying that it should be one state. What is the end result?
Well, look, the first thing is I very much understand why various countries are calling for the two-state or to recognize Palestine and so on. I'm very much in favor of this right now. Why? Because right now, the compelling issue is to block the Israeli annexation of Gaza and the West Bank. If you say the two-state solution is junk and gone, you're basically authorizing Israel to come in and seize Gaza and the West. Yeah, they'll say, sure, the two-state solution is over. No, that is why it's important for India, China, all these countries to keep insisting we support the two-state solution. Because what they are saying is East Jerusalem, West Bank, Gaza is part of Palestine, cannot be seized by Israel. Get the settlers out. It's illegal. You see, if you annul the two-state solution, then the settlers are not illegal. The settlers in the West Bank will say there's no two-state. Yeah. So at the moment, tactically, it's very important to continue to hammer on the fact that there is a two-state situation, and that is established in international treaties. Very important. That cannot be given up. In the future, there is a real debate to be had. In the future, a real debate to be had. And I'll tell you why. Because on the one side, this is an extremely small territory with extremely contested geographies. Every little town is a contest, of conflicting narratives of historical importance and so on. Every area. It's very, very congested in a sense, and dense. It's congested physically and it's dense historically and culturally. Everything is contested. Now, given that, there is no possibility really of two states. I mean, you got to find a way to link Gaza to the West Bank. How are you going to do that? Build a monorail? You're going to allow open borders. What are you going to do? Like you can have a closed train system where, you go from one country to the other. The only other example we have of something somewhat like this is Russia. Russia has an enclave, which is in Poland. Yeah. Tiny enclave. There's no real way to get there. If you're a Russian, you're basically out there enclosed. There's no land bridge. Yeah, you have to fly or go by sea. This is not a well-designed project of the three little parts of the Palestinian state: Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. It's very poorly designed. The one-state solution poses a serious challenge to Zionism, because the Zionist project argues that Israel is a Jewish state. Now, if it is a Jewish state and there's one state, it will no longer be a majority Jewish state. It will be very much near 50-50. And then the demography shows that most likely it will be a Palestinian majority state in time. Okay, well, that's a problem for Zionism. But it's interesting that Israel has been rather two-faced on this. They've never come out and declared we are a Jewish state. On the other hand, their entire legal structure supports the idea that it's a Jewish state. So you'll have to annul the idea that it's a Jewish state, which, I think Jewish supremacism in a state is a bad idea, like Hindu supremacism or white supremacism or any form of supremacism, very bad idea. But that's the foundational logic of Zionism. So the Zionists are going to have to withdraw their claim to a Zionist state and allow a secular democratic state to come in for one state. This is a very complicated debate around Zionism. So, I mean, the whole thing is unresolved. Yeah, you can't right now walk away from the two state. Tactically, it's absolutely necessary to maintain the two state solution. Whatever the Palestinians, Israelis come up with later, that's a separate matter because it is also true the two state solution is not manageable in this congested, dense population. But the one state solution annuls Zionism. Can Zionism be annulled? I'm not sure about that. I think that's a big fight.